St. Thomas Aquinas taught that what happens here is an analogy for the next world. Therefore, when we experience happiness here, then it's an analogy for the greater happiness that we will experience in union with God. So that when we understand happiness here, we know what it is we seek to some form in the next world. Well, that type of analogy also works between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we see the various elements, and then they are predecessors for the New Testament. Now, one example of this is manna. We see Jesus talk about manna in the desert, and that's the predecessor for the Eucharist. Now, the manna was food sent from God that arrived every morning as the Jews were going through the desert for 40 years. And it helped them receive their nourishment so they could continue on their journey. We also see that in light of the Eucharist. But what is the Eucharist? It is the body and blood of Christ that comes to us at Mass, and it is the result of Jesus' death and resurrection of the cross. As you can see, the Eucharist is more intense than the manna. Therefore, it implies that the spiritual journey is more intense than the physical journey. So always keep that in mind. We need the Eucharist for the spiritual journey because it's the more intense of the two journeys. And you can imagine that yourself. There you are. We'll just assume you're a day's journey or a few hours journey away from the oasis, and it takes everything you have to make it to the oasis. But also, we think it on a spiritual level, you are a week from the end of the month, and you know it's going to be a really tough week financially. You have a few options. One is to turn around and say, Lord, I expected my life would be a lot easier than this. I'm not going to believe in you anymore, and walk away. And the other is to humbly come before the Lord and say, Lord, help me make it through this week. We can see that that's the reality of the spiritual journey. Trusting in the Lord, especially in our most difficult times, especially when our spiritual environment is like a desert, which is why we need the Eucharist. Imagine this, going back to the physical side. The guy who turns around and says, journey through the desert, this is nothing. I can do this like nothing. And he walks in unprepared. You're going to find him in about a day. You can have the police come in, or whoever, the rangers come in and take away his body and bury him where he needs to be buried, because that's what's going to happen. He walked in obstinacy and pride, not being humbled before his environment, and therefore his environment destroys us. The same with us spiritually. We need to walk in humility within our reality so that we can receive all that the Lord gives us. Remember these words. This is from the 23rd Psalm, and this reminds us where we are. Though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me with your rod and your staff. Where are we? We are in the valley of death. What happens if we harden our heart and say, God, my way? You walk away from that path and you find yourself alone in the valley of death, and no one ever survives that. So we recognize that humility of receiving the Eucharist is important. And that's why confession before the Eucharist is also essential, because you're coming to the Lord in humility and saying, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Please forgive my sins that I may receive the grace that you offer to me, and I receive it more powerful in humility. So when we look at that reality, we can see what the Eucharist is all about. It is that food for the journey, but the more difficult journey than walking through the desert, the spiritual journey that leads us to the greatest of all treasures. God bless you.